The first time I noticed something unusual about David was last summer. I had just moved into the neighborhood after my divorce. It wasn't a bitter split, but it left me feeling lonely. The house I bought was perfect for a fresh start, modest with a beautiful garden in the back. David lived next door. He was in his late 30s, married to a lovely woman named Ellen. They had 2 young children who always played in their yard. From the outside, their family seemed flawless, a picture of suburban happiness. But I had seen Ellen leave for business trips, more frequently than seemed normal, leaving David to manage the house and kids. One Saturday afternoon, I was pruning the roses in my garden. When David came over to introduce himself, he brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies, a warm smile lighting up his face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, his tone friendly and genuine. "Thank you, David," I replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. It's nice to feel so welcomed. Over the following weeks, David and I struck up a friendly rapport. I learned he worked as a graphic designer and loved gardening as much as I did. We often talked over the fence, exchanging tips about keeping plants alive in the unpredictable weather. It was a rainy Tuesday when things took a different turn. The storm had knocked out the power in the neighborhood, and I was trying to figure out how to get my generator working. I heard a knock on the door, and there stood David holding a flashlight. "Looks like we're both in the dark," he said with a chuckle. "Need any help?" I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. Sure, I was just about to wrestle with the generator. David followed me into the garage, where the generator sat gathering dust. He seemed to know his way around it, and within minutes it was humming to life. "You're a lifesaver," I said. Grateful for his help, he smiled. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It was as if the small space of the garage had shifted. The dynamic between us, it wasn't romantic. Not even remotely, but there was a tension. "Ellen's away again, huh?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "Yeah," he replied, his voice quieter now, another work trip. "She'll be gone all week." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain pounded on the roof, filling the silence between us. "Well," I said, breaking the awkwardness, "thank you again for your help." David nodded and turned to leave. But before stepping out, he paused. "If you need anything else, just let me know the next morning." I found myself thinking about David more than I care to admit. It wasn't what he said or did. It was the unspoken weight in the air when we were in the garage. I shook it off as nothing more than overthinking. Later that day, I decided to bake some muffins, to return the favor for the cookies he brought when I first moved in. It seemed like a friendly, neighborly thing to do. When I knocked on his door, he answered almost immediately, as if he had been standing nearby. He wore a casual shirt and jeans, and his hair was slightly disheveled, probably from a day spent at home with his kids. "Hey, this is a nice surprise," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The house was surprisingly quiet. "Where are the kids?" I asked, setting the tray of muffins on the kitchen counter. "There with my mother-in-law for the day," David replied. "She likes to take them out whenever Ellen's away. Gives me some time to catch up on work or, not work." He laughed, though it sounded a bit forced. I nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. I wasn't sure why I felt nervous. This was just a neighborly visit, yet something about the quiet house and the way David seemed unusually relaxed unsettled me. "I hope you like blueberry muffins," I said, trying to shift the energy. "Are you kidding? I love them," he said, grabbing one off the tray. He took a bite and gave a dramatic sigh of approval. "These are amazing. Ellen's baking isn't even close to this." I laughed. "Don't tell her you said that." We sat down at the kitchen table, chatting about small things. His work, my plans for the garden. The storm from the night before. David seemed at ease, but every now and then, his gaze lingered a little longer than usual. "Ellen and I used to talk about starting a vegetable garden," he said out of nowhere. "But she's always so busy." Sometimes it feels like he trailed off, shaking his head as if to dismiss the thought. "Feels like what?" I asked gently. David hesitated. "Like I'm always the one holding everything together," he admitted. Don't get me wrong, I love her. But it's exhausting sometimes, you know? I didn't know what to say. His words felt heavy, almost like a confession. I wasn't sure if it was appropriate for me to listen to this, but at the same time, I didn't want to leave him feeling unheard. I get it, I said finally. Relationships can be complicated. David looked at me, then his expression soft but searching. Yeah, he said quietly. They really can be. The moment stretched, and I felt the air shift again, just like it had in the garage. I stood up abruptly, breaking the spell. I should get going, I said, forcing a smile. I've got some errands to run. David stood as well, walking me to the door. Thanks for the muffins, he said. And for listening, I nodded. Unsure of what to say, as I stepped outside, I felt the cool breeze on my face and let out a breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. The days that followed felt oddly charged. Every time I went into my garden, I found myself glancing toward David's house, half expecting to see him there. When I didn't, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. It wasn't until Thursday evening that I saw him again. I was watering the plants when I noticed him standing by the fence, a beer in hand. Hey. He called out, got a minute? I hesitated before nodding sure. David walked over, leaning on the fence. I hope I didn't make things weird the other day, he said, looking genuinely apologetic. I guess I was just feeling off. It's fine, I said quickly. We all have moments like that. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You're kind, you know, that not everyone would have listened. I shrugged, unsure of how to respond. Well, that's what neighbors are for, right? David laughed softly, but there was something else in his expression. Something I didn't want to name. I actually wanted to ask you something, he said after a pause. Okay. Would you mind helping me out with a project? He asked. I'm trying to build a raised garden bed for the kids, but I could use an extra pair of hands. Ellen's not back until the weekend, and I figured since you're into gardening. I hesitated, it seemed harmless enough. But something about the idea made me uneasy still. I didn't want to overthink it. Sure, I said. Finally, I'd be happy to help. We agreed to start the next afternoon. When I arrived at his backyard, David had already laid out the materials. Wooden plank screws and a toolbox. This is more ambitious than I thought, I joked, surveying the pile of supplies. Yeah, I might have bitten off more than I can chew. He admitted with a sheepish grin. We worked side by side, measuring and cutting the wood. Then assembling the pieces. David was focused, but every now and then his hand would brush against mine as we held the planks in place. Each time I felt a jolt, as if the contact carried more weight than it should have. At one point I caught him watching me as I hammered in a nail. What I asked, trying to sound casual, nothing, he said quickly, looking away. I was just thinking how nice it is to have someone around to talk to. It gets quiet when Ellen's gone. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond. The sun was setting now, casting a warm glow over the yard. The project was nearly done, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to finish. As we secured the final plank, David sighed and stepped back to admire our work. It looks great, he said. It does, I agreed. For a moment we stood there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I felt the pull again, that strange, unexplainable tension that seemed to bubble up whenever we were alone. I should get cleaned up, I said. Abruptly stepping away, David nodded, his expression unreadable. Thanks for your help, he said. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted again, like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us could name by the time Saturday rolled around. I convinced myself that I had overthought everything. David was just a neighbor, a kind man who needed help and conversation while his wife was away. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the weight of our last encounter lingered in the back of my mind. Ellen returned that evening. I saw her pulling into the driveway, the kids bounding out of the car and into her arms. From my window, they looked like the perfect family, and I felt a pain of guilt for whatever it was I'd let myself feel these past few days. It was later that night when I heard the knock. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 10 p.m. My heart sank as I opened the door and saw David standing there. "Hi," he said softly. He was dressed casually, but his hands fidgeted at his sides, a clear sign of nerves. "David," I said, keeping my voice low, "what are you doing here?" "Ellen's back, I know." He replied, his gaze steady but conflicted. "Can I come in just for a minute?" I hesitated, my better judgment screaming at me to say no. But I stepped aside anyway, and he walked in. He didn't sit down, just stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the floor as if searching for the right words. "I don't know how to say this," he began, "but these past few days spending time with you, it's made me realize how lonely I've been." "David," I said, my tone firm, "this is dangerous territory. I'm not trying to complicate things," he said quickly. He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I don't feel this way often or ever. And I need you to know that." I felt my breath catch, my mind racing for the right response. "You're married," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You have a family." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I love them, but sometimes it feels like I'm invisible in my own home." I looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "You're not invisible, David," I said gently. "But whatever this is, it can't happen." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with both regret and understanding. "You're right," he said. I needed to say it to get it out so it doesn't eat me alive." I walked him to the door, my hands trembling as he stepped outside. He turned to face me one last time. "You're a good person," he said. "Better than I am, maybe." I didn't respond. I simply watched as he walked back to his house, his figure disappearing into the shadows. That night I lay awake replaying the conversation over and over. I knew I had done the right thing by setting boundaries, but part of me still ached for the connection we'd shared, however fleeting it was. The next day I saw David in the yard with his kids, Ellen laughing as she watched them play. He waved at me from across the fence, his smile warm but distant, and just like that, everything seemed to return to normal. But deep down, I knew it was a line we had come dangerously close to crossing, a moment that would forever remain unspoken between us.